Thank you for joining us today at the IdeaGen Foundation. My name is James Fitzgerald. Here is my colleague Maria Bizaki. Today we have the honor of interviewing Ambassador Theros, Patrick Theros, former ambassador to Qatar. Ambassador, thank you for the time you're giving us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very happy to have met you both.
Likewise. So, getting started, our first question is, you've had monumental experience over your 30 years in the Foreign Service for the US in areas such as Nicaragua and South America, the Mideast, Qatar, and the UAE, to name a few. Could you tell us a bit about what originally drove you into the area of Foreign Service as a career?
This is not a joke. I grew up in the District of Columbia. First of all, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us.
But I grew up in the District of Columbia in a high school, junior high school and high school, particularly high school, because that's when you got driver's licenses and could drive. And we had a whole bunch of kids from foreign embassies whose parents would pick them up with tags that said DPL on it. And a lot of it was, hey, that's what I want to have when I grow up. So I was introduced to diplomacy by kids primarily. A very good friend of mine was the son of the Indian commercial attaché. Another good friend was from the what was then the exiled Estonian embassy, because you know that the Baltic republics were under Soviet control until the end of the Soviet Union, but we had consistently recognized the Baltic republics as independent, and they had exile embassies here in Washington. And the daughter of one that was my classmate all the way from junior high school through college. So I had a fair, how can I say, introduction to what life was like. And I grew up in a household where my dad and my mom were both obsessed with politics, particularly international politics, to a great degree of what was happening in Greece and in the surrounding area. My dad never opened the sports page in the newspaper. So my whole life growing up was political. And as I said, I had a good idea of at least what life was like for these kids coming in. So it was a good fit. Now, there was a sort of a brief detour. My mother badly wanted me to be a naval officer. And I got an appointment to Annapolis, and everything was done, and then I couldn't pass the physical. So I applied in March by this point. I applied to Georgetown School of Foreign Service, to the equivalent schools in American and GW, and Georgetown accepted me within a week for reasons that I still don't comprehend, because my grades weren't that great. I got in 4 years at Georgetown. I had this monomaniacal idea that I was going to be a diplomat. And it wasn't until senior year that I realized that was a long bet. It was a long shot. In 58, about 10,000 people applied for 150 openings in the Foreign Service. So I was senior year, I was frantically taking courses in business administration just to have something in the likelihood that I wouldn't pass the exam. But I passed the exam, got all the way through it. I'd say, much to my surprise, but that's the good news. And then I was in it. We had the Foreign Service, the entry courses. The U.S. Foreign Service has changing now. Doesn't have a lot of formal training early on. You bring in brand new officers. You give them what is essentially an orientation, a little bit of an orientation course, the first post they're going to, and then your first assignment is regarded as a training course, as an apprenticeship. So my first assignment was Saudi Arabia for that purpose.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's a long answer. Apology.
Of course. Sounds like environment and just how you were brought up and where you were had a large impact.
Oh, absolutely.
Excellent.
I mean, there's no doubt. Washington's a great town to grow up in.
Definitely. So continuing on from that, your actual career, what would you say were some of the highlights, some of the best bits of your career that you
Best
enjoyed?
In terms of history or best in terms of permanent enjoyment, would you?
Both, whichever your preference.
Historically, there are a few moments where I was sort of part of history. For example, in 1973, when during the October War, something very similar to current history. A week before Syria and Egypt attacked Israel, a good friend of mine, a local Bedouin sheikh, came over, so asked me to come have coffee with him, and he said, "By the way, Syria is going to attack Israel in 6 days."
Oh.
And my first response was, "You got to be kidding." He said, "No, no." I said, "Well, how do you know that?" I said, "My cousin told me." And what is your cousin? How does your cousin know? Well, he's assistant chief of staff and for operations in the Syrian army. And why would he tell you? Well, my side business is large scale smuggling operations, and all my trucks were being confiscated by the army for a future operation. So I asked him, and he told me. We reported this back to Washington. Washington consulted with the Israelis, and the Israelis said, "Oh, you got to be kidding. It's not going to happen. We know all about this. Your diplomats don't know anything." And it's as if somebody took that same, and then on the 6th of October, they were attacked. And it's as if somebody took that same scenario, precisely the same scenario of Israeli hubris, conviction that they were too strong to be attacked, conviction, sort of a disdain for the fighting qualities of their enemies, and so forth. And exactly the same thing happened October 7th.
Definitely mirroring the events today.
Yeah. So that was important. I was in Damascus when Sadat made his speech saying he wanted to come to the Knesset. This was what year was this? It would have been 1977, 78. Sadat came to Damascus. We had numerous meetings. We were involved in trying to persuade the Syrians to go with him to Israel. Syrians refused. Later, it became sort of obvious Sadat didn't want them to come with him. But all this, again, living this part of history. I was in Jordan, my second tour in Jordan, when Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait. I mean, at that point, I was terribly lucky because I was between ambassadors. Mm-hmm. I was chargé d'affaires. I'd been deputy chief of mission until then. And I was summoned by King Hussein at about 9 or 10 o'clock at night saying, "I need to see you now." Went over there, and essentially he told me I just got off the phone with Saddam Hussein, who was so angry that he couldn't see straight and really afraid of what he's going to do. So back to the embassy, middle of the night, sent a telegram to Washington, went to bed, woke up 4 hours later to a phone call saying, "Your telegram arrived about an hour before Saddam Hussein's troops crossed the border. Now you got to get King Hussein to stop it." And then the rest is history again. So these are a few moments where I really felt that I was part and parcel of history.
Certainly. Yeah. It sounds like you were right in the thick of things.
Yeah. I suppose. Think of things meaning you're being shot at.
Apologies. But sort of continuing on from that, mm-hmm. You've seen some major historical events in the Mideast. Mm-hmm. What were some of the challenges that you found in your various positions working in the Foreign Service, especially in that region?
The biggest challenge is your own government. And I think this applies to every foreign service in the world. Just to illustrate this on a fairly minor issue, I was chargé d'affaires again in Abu Dhabi for a long period of time. One ambassador resigned for medical reasons. The next ambassador was delayed for a year and a half. So I was chargé for a year and a half. Mm-hmm. And at one point, and we're discussing some issue, and the issue was so important that I've completely forgotten it in that sense. But it was, so the person in charge of Arabian Peninsula affairs, good friend, called me and it told me I should, get the message, stop sending messages objecting to what Washington is doing. And my response was, we argued a bit. And his comment, he said to me, Patrick, you don't get the big picture. And I responded saying, Bob, you're responsible for the big picture. I'm responsible for the small picture, which is the relationship with the UAE. If you order me to do something, I'm going to do it, but you can't order me not to express my opinion.
Of course, yeah.
And I mean, and this scene has been repeated by hundreds of diplomats in hundreds of embassies, thousands of diplomats at hundreds of embassies around the world since they invented communications. I imagine the Hittite diplomat in Troy was sending similar messages back to the Hittite capital saying, you're doing this all wrong.
Mm.
Yeah. And so it is easier. You're there, you're dealing with the foreign government. So in terms of a challenge, and you're not always right. I mean, a good diplomat prides himself on being always right, but we're not that way. But we're right often enough. The problem is that your right, your correctness really does apply to the bilateral relationship, and your job is to improve the bilateral relationship, and if it can't be improved, to mitigate the damage being done. It may not fit with what Washington, with your home capital has in mind. It may simply be they don't care about the bilateral relationship, or they're prepared to sacrifice some part of the bilateral relationship, or they believe that I wasn't trying hard enough to change their minds, which also happens very frequently, and is probably the greatest source of frustration for service officers abroad.
Fair enough.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for sharing. It's really fascinating how you experienced all these historical events, and at the same time you're sort of balancing fostering these relationships while also having to represent a government. So that's really fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of shifting a little bit, outside of your professional experience, you've also had a lot of experience with non-governmental organizations and events. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit on your experience with that.
Not primary, but the longest term experience in international organization that's in the news today, which is UNRWA. The UN Relief Works as an agency. This was founded in 1948 to attend to the Palestinian refugees. After the Arab-Israeli war, depending on which side you're on, they fled or they were expelled. 700, 800,000 people were expelled from Palestine. The Arab-Israeli War of 1948, the Palestinian-Israeli War of 1948 has never ended. And one thing we should keep in mind, it's been continuing. There is the numerous Security Council resolutions that have never been implemented that might have ended that war. So by default, the international community has taken responsibility for the well-being of the refugees. Now, in some cases, these people are still real refugees. In some cases, they're well established, but they're the descendants of refugees. And then we are today with what is happening, the accusations that UNRWA members are members of UNRWA, staff of UNRWA, have been members of Hamas as well. And I was rather, to me, disturbing, at least, statement this morning. Carnegie Endowment had interviewed with David Satterfield, who's, aside from being much younger than me, was, when I was in the Foreign Service, is now responsible for for Gaza, in the sense of he is the point person on the whole thing to do with Gaza. I'm not quite sure what his responsibilities are, because it seemed to be outside the normal way that we would have handled these things at another time. The decision-making, just as an aside, the decision-making circle in the Gaza war is much narrower than it's been in previous crises, in my experience. But anyway, that was a digression. More importantly, he stated that from the point of view of the United States government, and he's now speaking officially, UNRWA is finished and we have to find something else to do with it. This was the correct decision 75 years too late. 1948, for reasons that periodically I try and look it up, and they unfortunately hadn't invented Google before at that time. So a lot of that stuff simply isn't online. You go back and you read it. You read a lot of the 1948 records have shown up in the classified. We as the United Nations and as the leading part of the United Nations, having supported Israel at the beginning, decided that something had to be done about the refugees, and we created a UN agency that essentially took over the responsibility of the occupying power. If this, under the rules of various international agreements and treaties, the occupying power is responsible for the well-being of the people who are living in the area where you occupy. And this technically was Israel. Now, there were large parts of it that were not occupied, but they were under the responsibility either of Egypt or of Jordan. So legally, everything that is sort of used this phrase from the river to the sea was occupied by Israel, was occupied by Jordan, was occupied by Egypt, Gaza at the time. UNRWA took over the responsibilities of the well-being and welfare of the people of the occupied territories, and occupied in whatever way, and thereby relieved these three countries of the need of their responsibility under their treaty obligations to take care of the occupied population. And then after the '67 war, when Israel completed the occupation of all of Palestine, UNRWA continued, even though Israel was now the occupying power. UNRWA continues to be responsible for refugees in Lebanon and in Syria, because the Lebanese and the Syrian governments essentially refused to allow them to be integrated into the population. The UNRWA is responsible to a much lesser degree, but still for a large number of Palestinian people, Palestinian descent, children of refugees, even though Jordan has completely integrated them into their social, economic, political life. But Jordan is an exceedingly poor country and is also important to us. And again, we chose to funnel a lot of aid to the maybe 40-50% of the population of Jordan that is descended by the Palestinian from the Palestinian refugees, to channel it through UNRWA. So we essentially have maintained this organization that should not have existed in the first place. It was the responsibility of the states, and if we wanted to help those states take care of their refugees, we should have helped those states directly. But now, undoing this will be, if you think Gaza is a catastrophe now, let me tell you what sort of catastrophe you're looking at if, as David Satterfield said, UNRWA will end. This is the end of UNRWA. UNRWA cannot continue, and other agencies have to take care of it. That transition is going to be an absolute disaster, and I don't know how we're going to do it, and I don't think anyone has thought it through. Some other organizations that are really quite interesting, less well known, is an organization called the International Organization of Migration. It consists of a very small office in Switzerland, but they are responsible for coordinating international policies, or coordinating the policies of governments when there's mass migration for whatever reason. For example, during the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, something like 900,000 people fled Kuwait and Iraq and came into Jordan. And it was the IOM that was the coordinator for all the work to try and get these people. Very few stayed in Jordan, to try to get them through Jordan and out of the country. Another organization that I think we confuse sometimes is the International Committee of the Red Cross. Again, it is a coordinator. It's not an actual, it doesn't have Red Cross ambulances and stuff like that. It has two really important functions. One is the original function of the International Committee of the Red Cross was to coordinate humanitarian activities where necessary and to attend to prisoners of war. The Red Cross is in virtually every country that is ever in the world right now. There may be an exception, I can't think of one, has an agreement with the Red Cross that in time of war you will permit Red Cross representatives to come and visit the prisoners you have taken to make sure that they are being taken care of properly. And if you want to see a really funny, there was a very funny, though tragic comic movie called Stalag 17. Came out in the 50s, which is before you guys were born, but it was about a prisoner of war camp in Germany. And the Germans weren't treating the military prisoners that badly, but still below the standard set laws of war. And there is this very funny 15-minute scene of the Germans scrambling to raise the level of raise the quality of life of the prisoner of war because the Red Cross was coming next week and stuff like that. So it does, it coordinates things like prisoner exchanges and so forth, making it a terribly important organization. I mean, we really don't know how many international organizations exist, and these are the U.S. Department of State, for some obscure reason dating back to about 1912, actually has I'm trying to remember the exact name of the organization, but it was the Mexican-American Border Water Commission. It was formed to regulate the dams that go for either the Rio Grande or other rivers that flow from the United States into Mexico and vice versa. So the Department of State owns something like 25 dams. This is not what we were organized for, but it functions well because essentially we don't get involved with them. But it's that sort of international organization that is now, with climate change, becoming terribly important because the chunk of the Colorado River ends up in Mexico, and Colorado River is drying up. Everybody along the way, it's not just a problem with the states that are drawing water from the Colorado River. It is others. There is the UNDP, UN Development Program, which does, in many cases, it's sort of an international aid organization funded and run by the UN, and usually the director of each country of UNDP is the director of all UN activities in that country. And people like to badmouth the UN people until you ask them, what do you want to put in that play? You want to take the responsibility for doing this? The answer is no, of course. But so the UNDP, one of the usually best informed people in the country, once a diplomat shows up and you're early on as you're visiting your colleagues, one of the people you got to visit first or up front is the director of the UN Development Program, because he usually knows more about what's going on in the country than any of the embassies do. I could take up the whole rest of the dinner talking about them, but anyway, there are just numerous ones, and then you have the private ones. You have the Lutheran World Service, one of the Catholic Relief Services. These are all religiously organized. The IOCC, which you may have heard of, International Orthodox Christian Charities. These are all fantastic organizations, do great work. They do it on a shoestring. They probably get better results per dime spent than any of the big governmental operations. They really are good, and just because they are religious doesn't mean that they are involved. I mean, for example, my daughter worked as a couple of years at IOCC, at the IOCC mission in Bosnia. It was headquartered in Sarajevo, which was under the control of the Muslims, the Bushnecks, and half their work was in the Muslim area, and half their work were the Serbian Orthodox Christian areas. And they were extremely well respected. My daughter used to tell me that when other organizations couldn't cross the lines between these areas, IOCC could. And into Muslim areas, and people were really happy to see them, and no sense that just because these are Orthodox Serbians fighting the Muslims or oppressing the Muslims or having driven them out of their homes, there was no sense that the IOCC was taking sides in it. So, as I said, I could go on. Innumerable organizations.
No, those are some amazing insights, both with UNRWA and so many other agencies, organizations, and obviously extremely relevant to today. So thank you for sharing that. And kind of just combining your experiences with these organizations and in foreign service, how would you say more generally that NGOs can cooperate with embassies and governmental agencies? And do you think that's like an important relationship today?
So it's a very important relationship. As I said, UNDP, you start with that. We have aid programs. UNDP has aid programs. You could either go down your own little road by yourself and forget that your road came out here and their road came out there and never connected. There's all sorts of programs there. They can fill in gaps in what the U.S. is doing. The U.S. actually pays part of the bill for UNDP. There is when the Syrian civil war broke out in 2010, there is a very large refugee camp on the Jordanian-Syrian border. That is a large part of it is managed by the Orthodox Church in Jerusalem. The rest of it is managed by the Jordanians, but the World Food Program is in there. UNRWA is in there. No, UNRWA is not, because it doesn't cover it. But the World Food Program is in there. Catholic Relief Service is in there. The say Patriarch of Jerusalem is in there. All of these organizations, they not only they complement and supplement national efforts, and frequently substitute for national efforts where you can't go in and do something. And sometimes it's convenient. Politically, it's impossible to get aid money for pick a country. And so the international organization, but it's easier to give the money to the international organization. Even and the congressmen who vote for it know where it's going, but it saves them from having to explain to their constituents, why are you giving money to people we hate?
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And leading swiftly on from the NGOs, you've since retired from the Foreign Service and active career work, but you've been quite active in your retirement, quite productive. Could you describe to us what you've been doing in your retirement and potentially what people who aren't directly involved in the Foreign Service, like people in our generation who haven't yet joined, what could people do if they are?
What I do essentially grew out of my Foreign Service career.
I see.
About a year after, immediately as soon as I retired, I was hired by a property development firm, come on as advisor, and to help them find money, help them find investment into projects. Either the first one was a project, and actually our first project that I got money for was a project in Gaza. From an American company that was trying to develop a power project. We got power, and we had a hotel in Ramallah. We got financing from countries, from Qatar and elsewhere. There's an issue that again, in the purely commercial side, a number of companies use my services to either do business in Qatar or do business elsewhere in the Arab world or get investment into their companies. About a year after I left the Foreign Service, a little more than a year, I was asked to take over the U.S. Qatar Business Council. It was theoretically a part-time job, only 40 hours a week. And this is a bilateral trade association. It's not a lobbying organization. Basically, to do is simply make trade between two countries easier, facilitate it, find the right people to do it. Help Qatari companies that might want to do business here or are looking for suppliers here. Help American companies might want to sell something to Qatar. Help American companies looking for investments from Qatar. Help American companies that might even want to go set up a business there. And it's all these trade associations, I think, perform a valuable job, again, for the bilateral relationship. I also, initially for fun, but lately for more than that, I accepted an offer from the National Herald in New York, the Greek American newspaper, its English language edition, if I would write an opinion column. And I have to say, going back and reading my initial opinion columns, I sort of cringe. Their banality and superficiality. But then I got into it, and right now it has become a real vehicle for me to get my views out there, because once it's published there, then I get other organizations that I belong to spread it among their members, and some of which have some really influential members. And then the title of ambassador has a couple of benefits to go with. People think it's really important. So I'm a member of the board. I've been members of board of different organizations. Currently, I'm on the advisory board for the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University, part of the School of Foreign Service. I was on the board of an organization owning the Center for Christians for Middle East Peace, which is a religious organization trying in vain to foster peace in the Middle East. And so my wife tells me that she's very annoyed because I'm working harder or longer hours than I was when I was in the Foreign Service. But the retirement part is you get to do more things that you like. Now, I loved what I was doing in the Foreign Service, but there were moments, there was the tedium. One thing that I learned is when you got promoted, it was not always a good thing, because when you got promoted, you are now responsible for managing people. And let me tell you, I'd rather manage herds of goats and sheep than manage people. You get to learn too much about your employee's private life.
Right.
Particularly when you're abroad, where you're as the DCM or as the ambassador, you actually control his private life, and you get too much of that. But anyway, so I'm doing a lot. I've retired from the U.S. Qatar Business Council now. I'm advisor to a new think tank. Again, all of this being part-time. Mm-hmm. The part-time accumulates into full-time.
Of course, yeah.
But all this being part-time. A new think tank that was formed 5 years ago, actually 7 years, the time flies, called the Gulf International Forum. Two young people whose origins come from the Gulf area. One is a American-born academic of Kuwaiti origin, and her husband, who's a Qatari academic, have decided that after watching all the other think tanks here, there were too many people looked like me pontificating on these boards, and not enough people look like them. So they have done a really sterling job of bringing people from the Gulf to participate, to express the views on what's going on in the Gulf from the point of view that people actually live there, as opposed to people like me who studied or worked there and stuff like that. And so it's actually been quite satisfactory. I was primarily hired not so much for the Gulf side, but for the fact that being in Washington, I knew how to navigate Washington, which is frankly one of the most difficult cities in the world to navigate.
Wow, I mean, that is so inspiring, kind of just like taking a step back and looking at the trajectory of your career from foreign service and an ambassador and NGOs to really the plethora of things you've been doing after retirement is really amazing. So do you have any advice for potential candidates or young people like us who might be looking to get into some of these fields and how we can get started with that?
I've been asked that question repeatedly, and I've never felt that I've given a sufficiently correct and comprehensive answer. So take a look at it. First of all, make sure you really want to do it. My dad's best advice when I was going to, when I started school, my dad, like most immigrants, wanted his son to go do something he understood. Like, I want you to become a doctor, I want you to become an engineer, or stuff like that. My dad was fixated on, he wanted me to become an engineer. And if you look at my math grades at school, there was not a ghost of a chance of ever becoming an engineer. But it really was, do what you want to do, just be good at it. And there's a saying in French that my French isn't good enough to repeat that says basically, you do best what you like doing. So you have to begin with this sort of soul searching that says, do I really want to do this? Is this something that really appeals to me? Whether it's from the humanitarian point of view or the political point of view, or even the business point of view, where you want to live in places that are unfamiliar, where you look at every change as a challenge to be overcome, not an obstacle, where you really don't mind talking to people who, in your view, represent everything that you've ever been warned against. You have empathy, and not empathy in the sense of sympathy, but empathy is, to me, for a diplomat and for most people in this sector, the single most important quality. You've got to be able to understand why this guy who disagrees with you disagrees with you. And I used to tell students, somebody said to me, Arabs are illogical. And my response would be, Arabs are just as logical as the next person. They can do a syllogism just as well as you can. Primary assumption, secondary assumption, and conclusion. Where they differ is their assumptions are different, because they simply don't, they have grown up in a different environment. And this is one story I do tell. Sort of my interest in going, this was peaked when I was 13 years old. At that time, the Greek Orthodox Church used to operate a really good afternoon Greek school. It was 5 days a week, 2 hours a day. We went to church, and it was in the basement of the church, and the teachers were very good. They were inspired, and we were taught Greek, we were taught religion, and we were taught sort of a knowledge of Greece, historical. And the teacher I had, Mr. Tsikaridanos, I remember him well, was rather on the old-fashioned side, where you had to recite your lessons. So one day I would leave public school at 3 o'clock. The Greek school would start at 4 o'clock. It wasn't too far away, one from the other. And so I always had my public school books with me. And one day I was reciting from the lesson on the Crusades in Greek school. And we were studying the Crusades at the same time in 8th grade history in junior high school. And there literally was nothing the same about the subject. The Greek history of the Crusades and the Western history of the Crusades, which is what you get in the United States, dates were the same. That was it. And it was totally. And what made it even worse is there's the Greek word for crusader has no cognate with crusader in English, in Stavrophoros. So I didn't even make the connection until I read at one point in the book Ricardos Leondokardos, and this light went off and said, "This is Richard the Lionhearted." So when I sat down, I pulled out my public school book and rifled through. There's Richard the Lionhearted. Dates are the same, names the same. Nothing else is the same. In 8th grade history is really national mythology. It's not critical learning of critical history, but it's what sticks with us. It has a it's a bigger part of our memory than what we learn in college sometimes. And in the Western narrative, Richard the Lionhearted is simply the greatest guy that ever lived at that period of time. He is the guy in the white hat. He is the hero of all the Crusades. Every American kid who's ever studied about the Crusades has studied Richard the Lionhearted and what a great man he was, and how noble he was, and things like this. Greek history has a slightly different. The only reference to Richard the Lionhearted is on his way to the Holy Land. He stopped in Cyprus, looked around, and he was a guest of the Byzantine governor of Cyprus. And in the middle of the night, he got up, murdered the governor and his family, grabbed the island, and sold it to the Knights of the Hospital. That's literally the only reference to Richard the Lionhearted in the Greek history book. That was, again, the 8th grade equivalent Greek history book that I was reading from. So
Wow.
you've got to put yourself in a mindset where I don't have a monopoly of knowledge, and I don't have a monopoly of who's right and who's wrong. And yet, so if you are prepared to do that, then you're a good candidate for that. You also got to be a good candidate for first assignment in Saudi Arabia. The Dick Murphy, who was my boss, the Murphys invited me to lunch about the third day that I was there. Mrs. Murphy was one of the most remarkable women in Foreign Service wives I've ever met in my life. And while we're having lunch, the big mound of rice on the plate in the middle, an ant starts crawling across the rice. She reaches over, picks up the ant, drops it, and we continued eating as if nothing had happened. If you're prepared to do that, then you're a really good candidate for going abroad. And then if it's the Foreign Service or if it's one of the charities and so forth, you need that quality because you can't deliver your work without it. And you need, as I say, you need the quality where the ant crawling across the pile of rice doesn't help you that much. That help?
Wow, I'm mind blown. No, I think those are great takeaways, like empathy, passion, and a drive to do it. Really inspiring. Thank you.
And it's not always the same degree of comfort as the United States.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, there were too many, not too many, but there was sort of every tour I had, there was some junior officer on his first tour that couldn't leave America. I mean, physically he left America,
Mhm.
but he couldn't leave America. There was one very nice guy. Otherwise, he and I actually rented a house together in Nicaragua, in Managua, when I was there. And everything he complained about had the Nicaraguan as an adjective in front of it. And it dawned on me, this kid had no place, we're about the same age. This kid had no business being in the Foreign Service. And sure enough, at the end of the 2 years in Nicaragua, he resigned. He learned something, but he didn't learn anything. He never left the United States. And people, that's the kind of person, the Foreign Service may sound exciting, and you may have the necessary qualifications to do it, but you're not going to be able to do the job properly if you associate if your personal discomfort with the change overwhelms you. And it can overwhelm you.
Well, thank you for the insights. I mean, change of perspective and being able to adapt to those changes certainly sounds like it's crucial.
Yeah, you need certain chameleon-like qualities.
Right. And thank you tremendously for your time today.
It's
been an
pleasure.
honor speaking
It's
with
been
you.
a great pleasure.
We just have one last question for
Sure.
you, and then we'll let you go. If you could sum up in one lesson what your advice to future leaders, people in myself and Maria's generation, what would it be, whether they're going to the Foreign Service or NGO work?
I am a great believer in public service. I think that too many people associate public service with either the do-gooder or with why aren't you making real money in a good job? And the money itself is probably the single biggest reason people don't go into public service. In the last 20 or 30 years, I fear the idea of prizing individual over the collective is important when the collective is too strong. right now the collective is too weak. Feeling, and it's not just writing a check for a charity and stuff like that, because it makes you feel good, or because you can take 30% of it off your income tax or something like that. It is the lack of public service, or is to me one of the biggest reasons for the problems we find ourselves in right now. The polarization. If we actually encourage public service, I'm a great believer in the draft. I thought the draft was when we canceled the draft, essentially, it made a difference. It made a difference in the number of, for example, I saw the number of Greek American names in the entering classes of the Foreign Service. It just fell off a cliff. Before me, there were lots of Greek Americans in the Foreign Service. It's an educated community. It's a community that is relatively wealthy relative to other communities in the country. And yeah, it really dawned on me that the existence of the draft forced you to focus your mind. And it was one more thing to do in public service. And I'm really sad that is going away. Matter of fact, I would extend the draft to women as well. It's just 2 years of obligatory public service to me are important. There's other Americans there that you're never going to meet, or Greeks or things like that. I mean, one of the reasons that Greece actually has a better Gini coefficient, income spreads, than most countries in Europe or the United States, is universal military service. Everybody complains about it. All the men complain about it. All the men say, why are the girls getting to go to work straight out of college? And we have to go into the army for a year or whatever it is at any time. But it does create a sense, you may not like the guy in the tent with you in basic training and his feet smell, but you got to live with him for several months, and you get to learn to live. And also, this country was built by public servants. The highways were built by people who were in the public service. This country was defended by public servants. So I think that is, if there's a lesson for anything to be taken out of what you've heard tonight, is public service is good for you and it's good for the country, and good for your country and good for whether it's the person down the street or somebody half a continent away.
Excellent. Thank you again so
Thank
much
you
for your
again.
time today. It was a pleasure meeting you.
My pleasure.
And we wish you all the best going forward.
My thanks to Idea Jen and George Sefakis for setting these things up. Thank you.
Thank you.